The sky above Wakanda did not break so much as split a decision it had already been making. The Outrider horde pressed across the red plain in a wave that had been breaking against Wakanda's defenses for 20 minutes. Thousands of multi-limbed bodies that did not stop for exhaustion or grief or the math of their own losses. The energy shield pulsed and failed in sections. Avengers and Wakandan warriors fought with the focus of people who had given up on winning and were now only fighting the question of how long. The air tasted like copper and ozone and burning vibranium, the particular combination that meant a world was working very hard to survive the next 60 seconds. Then the sky changed. A wound opened above the battlefield. Jagged at its edges, burning with light that did not belong to this universe's spectrum, silent in the way that a sound is silent when it exceeds what the ear was built to process. It was not a space stone portal. It was not a sling ring. It was not any class of dimensional breach that Doctor Strange could have categorized, even with the time stone in his hand. It was something from outside the catalogue entirely. It lasted 1 second. Then 7 figures fell through. The first one hit the red earth, and the shockwave moved through the soil in a 20-meter radius, without cratering the ground, without fire, without any of the physics that normally accompany that level of force. He straightened. The air around him shimmered faintly, a discharge of solar energy. His body had been absorbing from a different star, and was still converting against the atmosphere of a world he had never stood on before. How? He looked at the battlefield with the rapid, deliberate assessment of a man who had already made his decision about what he was going to do. The symbol on his chest caught the Wakandan afternoon sun. It looked to everyone who saw it in those first 3 seconds like the most specific version of one particular word. His senses pulled in the field before the Outriders could close the distance. 10,000 in the horde. 40 defenders holding 3 position lines against odds that should not have held. And at 3 kilometers, and closing, a presence that was not a sound and not a signal, but something heavier than either, the weight of something very certain, moving toward a decision it had already rehearsed 1,000 times. The others landed around him. A woman in red and gold who touched the ground with the assurance of someone who had been finishing battles for 3,000 years. A man in a cowl who came down on a grapple line, already mapping, already filing the tactical picture before his boots found soil. A figure that arrived as an absence and then chose to be a presence. Tall and gray-green, its eyes reading the battlefield with something that was not attention. A green ring blazed to life, and hard light bloomed outward in an instinctive barrier. 2 more figures completed the arrival. 7 total. The sky behind them was already sealing shut. Real quick before we dive in, because I need to know. Which character do you want to see cut loose in a world that has absolutely no business surviving them? Drop it in the comments. All right, here we go. The Outriders did not distinguish between Avengers and newcomers. The nearest wave redirected toward the new mass of targets without slowing, which was the first mistake any of them made that day. The first Outrider reached the man with the glyph. He caught it in one hand, not with effort. The way you catch something you spotted falling off a shelf. He stood there, holding a creature that had driven entire platoons backward, and looked out at the mass of the horde with an expression that was not contempt and was not alarm. It was the expression of a being that had settled a long time ago what its power was for. The nearest Outriders slowed, not because he threatened them, because something in their animal processing encountered a datum it could not file, a thing that did not read as prey and did not read as predator, and was simply standing there holding one of them, waiting to see what happened next. The hesitation rippled backward through the horde. 10 rows deep, 20. Tony Stark's faceplate was up. He had been mid-sentence to Rhodes when the breach opened, and was still looking at the point in the sky where it had been. "Friday," he said. "Scanning. 7 entities." Friday paused. Friday did not pause. Biometrics not on file. Energy signatures outside any known classification. "Outside any known classification," Tony repeated. "So completely outside." "The first one's solar absorption is registering in ranges I don't have units for, sir." Thor descended toward the newcomers from above. Stormbreaker leveled, lightning running the haft in the way it ran when he was keeping something controlled. He had 10,000 years of pattern recognition behind the reed, unknown, powerful, unannounced, in the middle of a battle for everything. The protocol for that had never been hospitality. He landed between them and the main Avenger line. "You will identify yourselves," he said. The visitor looked at him, not the look most beings gave Thor when confronted with Stormbreaker and 10 millennia of divine authority. A different look. The look of someone who had stood in front of comparable things before and had already settled quietly and completely what he thought about them. "We're not the enemy," he said. His voice did not require volume to carry. Thor's grip did not loosen. The angle of Stormbreaker shifted fractionally. From intercept toward assessment, the axe head still crackled. The lightning found no target. The man in the cowl had spent those first 30 seconds not watching, but cataloging. He had separated from the others before any of them had finished orienting, moving along the inner edge of the field with the focused attention of someone building a structural map from position data and movement patterns. The alien infantry ran through 4 commanders occupying the outer positions. The northern energy shield was failing in 2 grid sections. The figure with the axe descending from above, defender by trajectory and body language, the armored figure watching the newcomers analytically from behind a raised faceplate. Same assessment. Allies, probably. Threat if wrong. He started building the contingency for if he was wrong. Steve Rogers had been watching him for 15 seconds. "He's not watching us," Steve said to Tony, who had arrived at his left without either of them planning it. "Already knows we're not the threat," Tony said. He studied the cowled figure's methodical scan of the field's actual dangers. The way expertise felt familiar when you recognized it across disciplines. "That's someone doing exactly what I do when I walk into a room I don't know." "Yeah," Steve said. He lowered his shield by 2 inches. "That's why I'm not pointing this at him." The first of the 7 pressed 2 fingers lightly to his temple. What passed between them was not sound. Wakanda's sensors could not detect it. The Avengers felt it only as a pressure shift, the way the air changes before a storm, and then it was done, and the 7 of them had a shared picture of the battlefield in the same second. The gray-green figure had moved through the field invisibly the way it could, and had chosen to. It passed through the mines at the outer edge of its range, not intruding so much as listening, and what it found underneath the tactics and the fear and the hard specific focus of people in a battle they had nearly stopped believing they could win was not a thought. It was a wound, a name that lived in every mind it touched, like a pressure so constant that no one carrying it had noticed the weight anymore. Thanos. It sent the name to the visitor, not the word, the weight the word carried. The weight of a name that everyone holding it had already taken to the math, and the math had come up the same way every time. Clark Kent stood in the red earth of a world that was not his own and felt something pressing at the edge of what he could hold. The breach behind them was closed. There was no way back. The name was in every direction, in every mind on this field, like something the ground itself had known and had been dreading. He looked toward the horizon where the presence was building, patient, certain. already sure of what it was about to do. He had faced presences like that before. Beings that confused their certainty with correctness. Beings that had mistaken the math for mercy. He had never agreed with that argument. Not when it came from Darkseid, not when it came from the universe's own law. He was not going to start now. Thor's Stormbreaker did not lower for 11 seconds. 11 seconds was how long he assessed the man with the glyph before the axe head stopped crackling at full intercept angle. Not because the man had moved, because he had not. Standing in the smoking remains of an Outrider impact radius, with alien shock troops repositioning around him and a battle he had arrived in without any warning at all, the figure in blue had simply looked back at Thor with an expression so free of tactical anxiety that Thor's 10,000-year-old instincts for reading threat had been forced to recategorize. "You will identify yourselves," Thor said. "Now we're not the enemy," the man said. Thor studied the glyph. He had crossed the 9 realms, threaded the dark paths between galaxies, stood before beings that passed themselves off as gods in civilizations too young to know better. In 10,000 years of cross-dimensional passage, he had never seen that particular symbol. Not once. Not in any catalogue of sigils, divine marks, or alien house signs he had ever walked under or fought beneath. The glyph meant nothing he could place. What it resembled, to beings that had a word like it, he registered without committing to it. Hope was a dangerous thing to attribute to an unknown, but his grip shifted, not surrender. The beginning of calculation. Steve Rogers arrived at his left, without ceremony, and did not step in front of Thor, which Thor noted because the things that subordinated themselves to him tended to want the front position. The soldier stood beside him and looked at the 7 newcomers, the way a man who had survived things by reading rooms correctly reads a room fast, methodical, unwilling to commit before the evidence was in, not threats, not allies. Unknown, working variables. He watched the one with no visible power source, the one in the constructed armor that read as human financed rather than granted, wearing the tools of someone with significant resources and nothing else to rely on, the one who, at this exact moment, was not watching the standoff. He was watching the Outrider battle, the positions of the Black Order, the failing sections of the energy shield above Wakanda's northern grid. Steve lowered his shield by 2 inches, not surrender. A recalibration that his body completed before his mind had finished the logic. The Outrider wave hit the combined position before anyone had finished deciding what to say to each other. 300 of them, the ones that had been redirecting since the breach closed, a feral, multi-limbed surge of alien shock troops with no interest in the philosophy of the standoff. They knew only the operational directive: close with the enemy, destroy whatever breathed. The man in red moved. Barry Allen was gone before Steve had completed the processing of a breath. He was in the Outrider mass before any of them had taken a second step. And what he did there was not fighting in any sense the Avengers databanks could have labeled. He moved through 300 bodies with the precision of a man who had already mapped each trajectory the moment he entered the field. Not punching through, not fighting. He used their momentum against itself, turned their forward impulse to drop them, disarmed the ones with weapons before the weapons could fire, positioned 3 bodies to knock over 6 more in a cascade of calculations executed at a speed that made the entire process look like an afterthought. He was gone for 2.8 seconds. When he came back to his starting position, he was carrying 12 Outrider weapons in his arms like he had gathered them off a shelf. He set them down neatly. "There are about 47 still mobile on the left edge," he said, slightly apologetic, to no one in particular. "I didn't want to overdo it. Thor's Stormbreaker lowered by exactly 6 inches. Steve Rogers said nothing. He was looking at the place where Barry Allen had been bind 8 seconds ago, and the place where Barry Allen was now arriving at the understanding that the space between those two positions was not distance that had been covered. It was a law of physics that had been courteously declined. Superman took the left flank, Wonder Woman took the right. The Outrider encirclement that had been threatening to close on the Avengers' defensive perimeter, the kind that had been making the battle's arithmetic look increasingly unfavorable, collapsed in under 2 minutes, not through explosions, not through mass destruction. Through 2 beings moving across the field faster and with more economy than anything the Avengers had on the field, and neither of them appearing to work at it in any way that registered on sensors as effort. Green Lantern drew on his ring's reserve and laid a hard light barrier along the main defensive line, 40 meters wide, solid as reinforced steel. Aquaman held the rear position with the Trident of Neptune and the unbreakable patience of a man who understood holding ground as a discipline rather than a choice. Tony Stark, from behind his faceplate, ran assessments on all 7 simultaneously. The numbers came back wrong. Not wrong as in dangerous, wrong as in outside any reference class he had ever built a reference class for. Martian Manhunter extended his telepathy fully across the battlefield. He was careful about full extensions. They touched everything within range, without distinction, and everything within range in a battlefield was a great quantity of grief moving at high velocity. He passed through the Avengers' minds at the lightest setting available to him, the way a careful reader moves through a room without disturbing the sources of its energy. Not an invasion, not a search, a listening. What he found was grief. Not the grief of people in danger. He had read that before, in every war his universe had ever produced, and he knew the particular texture of it, the way it sat in the body, taut and immediate. This was the grief of people who had arrived at the threshold of a loss they had seen approaching for months, who had spent that time looking for a path around it, and who had not found one. The Avengers carried it differently from each other. The soldier in the shield carried it as duty, converted to resolve. The armor carried it as a calculation that kept returning the wrong answer and would not stop running. The archer who was no longer on this field had left a ghost in the people who remained. The woman holding the light around the dying man at the field's center carried it as something past grief and into its own category. And underneath all of it, in every mind, the same weight, not a thought, a constant, a name that had been present in so many minds for so long that it had settled into the texture of how each of them understood every other thought they had. He turned to the visitor, the man with the glyph. Thanos has 5 of the 6 stones. He said it aloud, though the battlefield made it a private thing, meant for Clark alone. The 6th is housed in a man on this field. His name is Vision. His body is failing. A woman named Wanda Maximoff is trying to protect the stone while he fails. Thanos is coming for it. Clark did not turn his head from the horizon. How long? Minutes. The man in the cowl reached Tony Stark's position without having been invited there and without announcing the approach. Tony's sensors flagged him as baseline human. Heart rate elevated but controlled, no biological enhancement. Gadget profile, consistent with someone who had financed their combat capability across years of significant private resources rather than been granted anything by anyone. The armor's analysis reached its conclusion. Significant intellect, significant resources, 0 inherent powers. You're absolutely a sidekick, Tony said. The man in the cowl did not respond to this. Tony looked at him for the 0.3 seconds that Tony Stark needed to shift from one register to a different one. He opened a secondary display and did not say anything clever. He started talking. The man in the cowl started listening with the specific quality of attention that Tony recognized after a few seconds as the same quality of attention Tony Stark gave information he intended to do something with. Steve Rogers found Thor standing at the perimeter of the cleared field, watching Wonder Woman complete the last pass of the right flank. Thor had the particular expression he wore when something had failed to fit any existing category and the filing was still in progress. "Those are powerful beings," Thor said, "from beyond this universe's record. I can feel the difference the way one can feel in certain kinds of space that the air did not originally belong to the room." "Friend or foe?" Steve said. Thor watched the man with the glyph rise above the Wakandan field. "Not leaving." The eyes moved across the horizon with the expression that Thor recognized from mirrors, from the face of people he had watched go toward things they knew would cost them. The expression of someone who has calculated the direction of the worst thing and chosen to face it rather than estimate it from a distance. "He is looking for Thanos," Thor said, "the same way I am, with dread and conviction and no plan to run." A pause. "The one with the mark of hope on his chest." Steve Rogers watched the figure in blue above the burning field, looking toward a presence he had not yet seen and had already decided what to do about. 3,000 years of his own wars up there, probably. His own costs. His own version of the calculation Steve had been running since 1943, the one where you identify the thing coming toward you and settle the question of what parts of yourself you are willing to spend on the answer. He picked up his shield. "Yeah," he said, "that's friend." The Mark 50 was still partly assembled around Tony Stark's torso, the faceplate up, when he pulled the holographic display into the space between them. He had been running threat assessments on all 7 newcomers simultaneously since the moment they landed, and the numbers had been producing contradictions at a rate fast enough that he had started a separate file specifically for the things the assessments could not categorize. He was also trying to have a conversation. He could do both. He almost always did both. "The gauntlet is the weapon," he said. 6 stones, each one a singularity that predates the universe. Space, mind, reality, power, time, soul. He collects them, wears them, snaps. Half of all living things cease to exist, instantly, painlessly, randomly. He spread his hands. "No preference, no discrimination, pure probability. Is the gauntlet removable?" the man in the cowl said. Tony stopped. He looked at him. The threat assessment had run the figure opposite him as baseline human. No enhancement, no powers, gadget-dependent. The economic profile of someone who had purchased their capabilities over years. And yet the question he had just asked was the exact question Tony had been building toward for 2 years without stating it plainly. It's on his hand. Is it physically removable from his person? A beat, yes, technically. Then that is what we do. We tried, he is. You tried before you had us. The man in the cowl said it without emphasis. Not a taunt, a data correction. Tony looked at him for the 0.4 seconds required to determine whether the person opposite him was overclaiming or had simply identified the changed equation faster than Tony had gotten around to stating it. He opened a second display. He started a new file. On the ridge above, Thor did not ask Clark's permission to relocate. He flew there and let the direction of his departure serve as the invitation, and Clark followed because the invitation was clear and the god extending it was the type who did not repeat himself. They sat at the ridge's edge with Wakanda spread below and the battle still ongoing at the field's center. and Thor looked at Clark with the expression of someone who had decided, in the last 15 minutes, that this particular being was worth the full version of the truth, rather than the version calibrated for beings who might panic. "The stones," Thor began, and did not add preamble. "6 singularities that predate the universe, each one governing an aspect of existence: space, mind, reality, power, time, soul. Separately, each is sufficient to end this conversation at any time I choose. Together, in the gauntlet, they are effectively everything that exists in one hand." Clark listened. He had encountered cosmic-level weapons before: the Anti-Monitor's wave, Darkseid's Omega beams. The concept of the anti-life equation as a living argument, pressed against every free mind in the universe. He understood architecture that was designed to be unavoidable. What he had not seen was a weapon designed as a philosophical proof. The gauntlet was not a destruction device. It was a statement. It had been built, stone by stone over 30 years, to demonstrate that a particular argument about the nature of the universe was correct. "The final stone is the Mind Stone," Thor said. "It lives in Vision, a synthezoid on this battlefield. Vision is failing. One of Thanos' generals damaged the mechanism that keeps him stable. Wanda Maximoff is holding what she can around him. When Thanos arrives and takes the stone, he'll have all 6? Yes." Thor looked at him directly. "You understand what follows?" Clark looked toward the field's center. He could see Wanda at this distance if he focused, the red haze of her chaos magic around Vision's prone form, the specific energy signature of someone expending everything they had because there was no resource to conserve. "He believes it," Clark said. The sentence came out carefully because he wanted to make sure he was saying the right thing. The mercy of it. He genuinely believes the snap is something good. Thor's jaw set. This was not a new subject for him. He had clearly been on this subject many times, and had not arrived anywhere that felt like resolution. Yes, Clark absorbed this. He thought about what it meant to fight something that was not confused, not deceived, not simply operating on bad intelligence. Something that had looked at the problem carefully, run the math correctly, and arrived at the wrong answer through a chain of logic that held internally. That was the hardest kind of wrong, the kind that could explain itself. "Then we can't just beat him," Clark said. "Beating him proves nothing to him. Winning a fight doesn't close the argument." He looked at Thor. "We have to prove him wrong." The god of thunder had been thinking about this problem as a war problem for the better part of a year. The reclassification happened on his face in real time. Not agreement, not concession, but the specific recalibration of someone who had been solving an equation in the wrong category and had just had the category identified. He said nothing for a moment. He didn't need to. Dr. Strange had not been watching the ridge from a distance out of courtesy. He had been watching because the Time Stone was still in his possession, and the Time Stone kept running, and the futures it was showing him had shifted. Before the breach, he had assessed 1-4-0-0-0-6-0-5 scenarios. Most of them ended the same way. One did not. The breach had added variables, new lines opening in the future map, like fissures in stone, most of them closing immediately as the math resolved the way most possible futures resolve, catastrophically, narrowly, into the same outcome by different routes. But some stayed open. One in particular stayed open and had been staying open, and was staying open right now with a consistency he recognized as the particular persistence of a line that was real. The cost was different in this line. Who paid, it was different. The winning condition was the same. He found Martian Manhunter at the field's perimeter, where John's psychic presence registered on the edge of Stranger's sorcerous awareness as a deep, steady warmth, the specific resonance of a mind that had spent so long reading other minds that had developed its own unmistakable signature. "Don't let the speedster die," Strange said. "Not permanently." John turned to him with the quality of attention that meant he had already been thinking about this and had been waiting for external confirmation. "What do you know?" he said. Strange's eyes held the distant quality they held when multiple futures were running simultaneously. "Enough. Do not let him die permanently. That is the condition. The condition for what? For the one line that works." He held John's gaze. "The one in the armor has been building the same theory from the engineering direction. You have the other half. Find each other." He turned to go. John watched the sorcerer walk back toward the battle's edges. A man who had looked at 14 million futures and decided the most strategically valuable thing he could offer was 3 sentences and a direction. John filed this as probably correct. Then he went back to reading the field. He moved through the Avengers without visibility, a courtesy extended to minds that were under significant strain without additional intrusion. He had already done a surface pass. This was the full sweep, the kind that took everything, not just what people were thinking, but what they were carrying underneath what they were thinking. What he found was grief, not the acute grief of fresh loss, not the sharp grief of people watching something happen in the immediate present. This was chronic grief, organized and load-bearing, the kind that a mind builds its entire operational structure around because there is no resolution available, and the only other option is to stop functioning. The Avengers had been living with the knowledge of this for months. They had looked at every option and watched every one of them fail against the map. They were still fighting anyway, not because they believed it was working, but because stopping was not something they knew how to do. He held the weight of it without pulling back. John's was the last green Martian, the only survivor of a world that had died, the sole keeper of a civilization's entire history, the man who had learned grief as a permanent condition. He recognized the Avengers version the way you recognize a dialect of your own language heard in a place far from home. The same structure, different words, the same unbearable amount of weight. He went to Superman. "These people have been losing this war. Longer than we have been here," he said. "We did not arrive at the beginning. We arrived at the point where they have already accepted they may not win." He paused. "They are not fighting because they believe it will work. They are fighting because they cannot stop themselves from fighting." Clark looked at him. The expression on his face was the specific expression of someone absorbing information that confirms something they had already suspected and still needed to hear. "Then we change that," he said. "The universe still wants its price. I can feel the shape of it, not clearly, but it is present. Whatever we do here, it will cost someone something. It cannot be taken back from." Clark looked at the symbol on his chest. The Kryptonian glyph, the one that his birth parents had sent with him as the only piece of his world that survived, the one that carried a word from a language spoken only in memory, the one that meant something like the act of choosing, in full knowledge of the cost, to continue. He looked at it for a moment that ran longer than moments usually ran. "Then we are the ones who choose the cost," he said, "not the math." Not him, us. The second phase of the Batman and Tony conversation lasted 14 minutes. Tony kept the display up, but he was not looking at it. He was looking at the man in the cowl and deciding several things at once about what category to put him in. "The gauntlet cannot be countered by force," Batman said. He was looking at the field while he spoke, the habit of someone whose attention was never fully in the conversation, but always also somewhere else. Any energy output sufficient to destroy the gauntlet would also destroy the stones. If the stones are destroyed, you cannot reverse whatever he does with them. Force is not the answer. Established, Tony said. The gauntlet must be removed from his person while he is wearing it. Physically stripped from his hand between the moment he acquires the last stone and the moment he uses the completed set. That is the window. We tried that on Titan. We almost had it 3 seconds. Someone lost their composure and broke the hold at the critical moment. The coordination method was wrong, Batman said. A method that routes all participants through individual decision-making allows for individual failure, an emotional failure, a grief response, a split-second deviation from the plan. Any one of those breaks the hold. He glanced toward the perimeter of the field where John showed. A method that routes all participants through a single psychic relay does not have that problem. Everyone moves when the relay says move. The relay does not have grief. The relay has timing. Tony followed his gaze. The logic of it arrived the way correct logic arrived when you were being presented with something you had not built yourself but would have built eventually. Not as a surprise, but as a recognition. You want to use the telepath as a battle coordinator, he said. Yes. Tony looked at Jayon for 3 full seconds. Say. He thought about what it would mean to route his armor's movement coordination through a psychic signal instead of his own processing. He thought about how much he would hate that. He thought about how much he had hated every correct answer he had ever been given by someone other than himself, and how those answers had still been correct. That's insane, he said. He paused. That's also probably right. Martian Manhunter extended his range one final time before the battle changed, broad and deep, out past the lines and perimeters and the positions of both sides. He found the approaching presence the way he had once found the extinction of his own world, not by seeing it, but by feeling the air change in front of it. A pressure against every mind in range, not directed, not focused, simply present as gravity is present, as the awareness of a very large and very certain thing is present to everything in its vicinity. He sent the signal to Clark, not words, the feeling itself. Clark rose above the Wakandan plain without urgency. He looked toward the horizon at the far edge of the field, toward the place where the Outrider formations had parted to leave room for something that did not need formations. Below him, the Avengers held their positions. Batman and Tony Stark had closed the displays and were talking without gesturing, which meant they had passed from theory into plan. Thor was already descending toward the forward line. Steve Rogers had quietly shifted his people into a new configuration without announcement, because Steve Rogers had been reading battlefields for most of a century and did not need to be told when the shape of one was changing. Clark looked at all of it, at both universes present in one burning field, aimed at one problem, carrying all of their different costs toward the same horizon. John's signal resolved into one word in Clark's mind. Not fear in John's sending, not hope. The specific quality of a mind that has already made peace with the difficulty of what is about to happen, and is reporting it as clearly as it can. Coming, Clark held that word. He had been given harder words before. He had been given the word Krypton by a ghost in a crystal, had been given the word dark side as a future he could not yet see, had been given the word enough by people who had been waiting to see whether he was actually what the symbol on his chest implied. Every time he had arrived at the same place, the next moment, the decision to step into it, rather than wait for it to arrive. He kept his eyes on the horizon, on the place where the Outriders' formations opened and left room for something they already knew was coming. He did not look away. Thanos did not send the Black Order because he needed their help. He sent them because he was a general, not a brawler, and generals gathered intelligence before they committed. The Reality Stone had been running its passive scan of the new arrivals since the breach opened, an automatic function, the attention of an object whose entire nature was the knowledge of what was real and what could be reshaped. What it reported to him was an absence. 5 of the 7 newcomers had no origin point in the stone's map of how matter and energy had distributed themselves across this universe's history. They were not products of this cosmos's causality. They were not things the stone had ever encountered and set aside for later. They were things the stone did not have a category for at all. 30 years of planning had not included a variable without a known source. Thanos watched Green Lantern's hard light constructs, sustaining the containment cage where his generals had ended up. He watched the woman with the golden rope standing over Ebony Maw's unconscious form. He filed both observations, said nothing, and sent all 4 Black Order generals to assess the new arrivals and report. He told them to learn. What they learned briefly was this: Ebony Maw introduced himself with telekinesis because that was how he introduced himself to things that needed to understand the scope of his attention. He lifted debris, sections of the energy barrier, 3 Wakandan soldiers from their positions, held them suspended in a ring at 2 meters elevation without harming them, arranged them the way a man arranges items on a table when demonstrating that the table belongs to him. Thanos' mercy extends to all living things, he said. His voice had the quality of someone who had never needed to raise it and never would, including those who have arrived uninvited. Diana of Themyscira studied him from 10 meters. She had the warrior's quality of attention, not tactical assessment, something older than tactical assessment, the kind of attention that 3,000 years of surviving combat produced in the people who survived it. She looked at Ebony Maw the way she might look at a lock she had already identified the mechanism of. She was waiting for the right moment to use what she had. She threw the lasso of truth. Ebony Maw's telekinesis intercepted immediately. The lasso was a physical object, a length of golden rope moving through air on a trajectory that his power could map and redirect before it arrived. He reached for it the way he reached for everything in this universe that was made of matter, and therefore subject to the rearrangement of matter. The lasso did not stop. It was not made of matter in any sense that Ebony Maw's telekinesis had a protocol for. The lasso of truth was a divine artifact sourced from a metaphysical system that predated the Infinity Stone's universe and did not intersect with its physics. His power was mastery of physical arrangement. What wrapped around him was a compulsion that operated on a different category entirely, not on matter, but on the condition of truth, which is not a physical thing and cannot be redirected by a force that acts on physical things. The lasso settled around him, held. What came out of Ebony Maw under its compulsion was immediate and unguarded, not performance. The lasso did not allow performance. Raw belief, delivered at the same measured cadence he used for everything, but stripped of the layer of presentation that normally stood between what Ebony Maw believed and what Ebony Maw said. Xenos is the correction this universe requires. The math has been solved. All that remains is the implementation. Your kind cannot stop what has already been decided, because what has been decided is correct. Diana looked at him for a long moment. 3,000 years had given her a precise taxonomy of the different kinds of being wrong. There was the wrongness of deception, of a person saying one thing and meaning another, which was simple to identify and simple to respond to. There was the wrongness of confusion, of a person who had bad information and was acting on it faithfully, which required correction rather than opposition. And then there was this, the wrongness of absolute certainty, the wrongness of a person who had looked carefully, reasoned carefully, and arrived at a conclusion that was internally consistent and wholly wrong, who would never accept correction because from inside the certainty there was nothing that needed correcting. She had seen this before. She had seen it in generals, in kings, in beings who wore their convictions like armor. She had learned that the only answer to this kind of wrongness was not argument, but evidence. Yes. Then you are not deceived, she said. You are wrong, and I know the difference, because I have stood in front of both, and they do not feel the same. She did not give him time to respond to this. The God-Killer sword came to her hand, and she put Ebony Maw down with the efficient, minimal precision of someone who had been ending confrontations for 3,000 years and had learned that the ending should not be larger than the problem required. He would live. He would be unconscious for some time. She picked up the lasso and moved. Across the field, Cull Obsidian had tanked the Hulkbuster suit. This was the relevant benchmark for what Arthur Curry was about to attempt without water, without the sea creatures, without the particular amplification of standing on the ocean floor with the entire Atlantic pressing in every direction. Wakanda was landlocked. He was fighting stripped of his greatest advantages and fully aware of it, and he had decided this was not a reason to change his approach. The hammer arm hit him at full extension. Arthur absorbed it across his whole frame, his boots cutting twin furrows in the red earth, 3 meters of displacement that he used to measure the opponent's output and calibrate accordingly. He said nothing. Kings did not announce their next move. The trident of Neptune did not command water. It commanded the authority that water held in the ancient arrangement of elements that governed a world 2/3 covered by sea. The sky over Wakanda was connected to that arrangement by meteorological law that was older than the Infinity Stones and recognized the trident's claim regardless of geography. What came down from the Wakandan sky was not simply lightning. It was the elemental force that a maritime divine instrument could draw from any sky on any world, because the authority was real in a way that transcended location. Cull Obsidian absorbed the first strike. He was built for exactly that. The second, he did not absorb. Cleanly. Something in the elemental quality of it, the magic threading through what should have been ordinary electrical discharge, moved through his physiology in a way repulsors and sonic weapons had not. The third strike he was no longer standing for. On the Avengers perimeter, Thor watched this sequence with feelings too specific to name efficiently. He had called lightning his entire life. He had assumed for 10,000 years that the relationship between himself and that particular elemental force was a personal one. Watching the man with the trident pull the same thing from the Wakandan sky with a different instrument and a different authority was, specifically, not simple. He chose not to examine this in the middle of a battle and filed it for later. Martian Manhunter had moved toward Corvus Glaive at the moment Corvus had moved toward him, which meant they arrived in the same space at the same moment. This was usually how it ended for the person who moved toward Jan with a weapon. Corvus Glaive's weapon had been designed for vision. This was its specification and its entire brilliance. A glaive tuned to disrupt the vibranium-based density shifting mechanism of the Mind Stone's host body, pinning the synthezoid to a solid state and stripping him of the ability to make himself intangible. The weapon was a precise technological counter to a precise technological power. John Johns' intangibility was not technological. It was biological, cellular. The phasing of a green Martian operated at the atomic level, and was an evolved trait of a species that had existed on a world called Maleka Andra for millions of years before this universe had gathered sufficient heavy elements to forge a weapon made of a vibranium alloy. The glaive was reading the wrong manual. It was a solution to a problem that John's physiology did not recognize as a problem. Corvus drove the weapon through John's center of mass. It passed through him the way a hand passes through smoke. Corvus stood with his weapon extended through space that contained no resistance, and looked at the result with the expression of someone whose most reliable tool has just failed. In a way he had no framework, for John phased back to solid. He placed one hand against Corvus' glaive's temple, gently, the way a doctor places a hand to locate a pulse. What he read in the contact was not pleasant and was not simple. Corvus' glaive believed in the mission the way a soldier believes in a general, not out of understanding, but out of the specific, organizing loyalty that gives a person their identity when they do not have another source for one. On held that knowledge for exactly as long as he needed to, and then set Corvus down on the Wakandan earth. He straightened. "The glaive was not made for me," he said, "to the air as much as anyone. Proxima Midnight had centuries of battle experience, a spear that had tracked opponents through vacuum and across the curved surfaces of 3 different star systems, and the particular combat intelligence of someone who had been fighting for so long. She had beaten beings with precognition. She had beaten beings who could see the future. Speed, in her considerable experience, was a question of degree, something you had more or less of relative to your opponent." She looked at the man in red across the field and made her assessment in the time it took her to begin raising the spear. She raised the spear. Barry Allen had already been to the end of that motion, and back she turned. He was on her left. She pivoted and brought the weapon around in the arc she had used successfully on worlds where the most significant physical variable was gravity and the speed of thought, not the presence of a being who existed partially outside this universe's causal structure. He was standing beside the arc, holding her spear by its shaft, with an expression that was genuinely apologetic. Proxima Midnight understood, at this moment, that she had already lost. What she did not yet know was how quickly. Barry wrapped her own weapon around her wrists in a configuration that was restraining without being cruel, with the faint apologetic air of someone who genuinely wished circumstances had arranged themselves differently. He set her down next to Cull Obsidian on the Wakandan earth, with the care of someone placing a fragile object on a shelf. He came back to his starting position. 3 seconds and some portion of a fraction had elapsed since Proxima Midnight had begun to raise the spear. John Stewart built the containment cage around all 4 Black Order generals with the deliberate precision of an architect given a brief. He took seriously. Hard light from the ring, structured in the geometric layering that his architectural training had never quite left him, even now, even here, walls that were load-bearing in the sense of being sufficient to bear the load they would be given, dimensioned to restrain without crushing. Ventilated in the way of someone who had decided that what you built reflected what you believed. The cage was not punitive, it was functional. He checked the ring's charge and did the calculation. Enough for what came next. Tony Stark stood at the edge of the Black Order's position and ran the complete analysis. He had been running a version of it in the background since the breach opened, but now he had the full data set and could let the background process finish. He had watched the speedster clear 300 Outriders in under a second and return carrying their weapons. He had watched a woman stop Ebony Moore's telekinesis with a rope. Ebony Moore, who had stripped a gauntlet off Strange's wrist from across a room, who had immobilized the Hulkbuster with one hand, who had incapacitated the most powerful sorcerer on the planet from a distance. He had watched a gray-green figure phase through a weapon, specifically engineered to prevent phasing, because the weapon was built for a different kind of phasing entirely. He had watched a man command lightning who was not Thor. He had watched Aquaman take a direct hit from Coal Obsidian and choose not to go down, which was a thing the Hulkbuster had not managed. He had the data, he had the pattern, he knew what the pattern was. "Friday," he said quietly. "New threat assessment file. These 7 entities are not a threat. Flag them as an asset class. Category, things that just completely changed my priors." Steve Rogers had come to stand beside him without announcement, the way Steve always appeared at significant moments, as if the significant moments sent him a notification in advance. "They're with us," Steve said. Tony watched the containment cage settle into its final configuration, green light, steady, and architectural over the 4 unconscious generals. "I was already there when the woman put the rope on Moore." "I was there when he caught the first Outrider," Steve said. He was watching Superman in the distance, scanning the horizon with the focus of someone who had already moved on to the next problem. The way he stood with it, holding it with one hand, looking at the rest of them, he paused. That's what it looks like when someone has already made their decision about what they're for. Tony looked at him. "That's what it looks like when you know what you are," he said. Steve picked up his shield. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I said. The air changed." That was the first signal. Not sight, not sound, not any of the sensor arrays the Avengers had built their detection systems around. Footnote: the air changed the way it changes when something very large and very certain enters a room, and the Outriders felt it before any human or Kryptonian or Asgardian on the field registered the cause. The feral, multi-limbed horde that had been churning against the defensive line paused mid-surge and reorganized, flowing from chaos into something that resembled formation, instinct firing through the mass of them in a wave of animal recognition. Their commander had arrived. The Avengers pulled into position, with the muscle memory of soldiers who had spent months preparing for this, and had never quite found a way to believe it would not happen. Tony's faceplate locked. Thor raised Stormbreaker, and his expression went somewhere past grief, and into the specific focus that grief becomes when you have learned to work with it rather than through it. Steve Rogers shifted his weight forward to the edge of his stance, and picked up his shield. Superman felt the arrival at 2,000 meters, not through sight, not through the super hearing that was registering everything on the field at once. Thanos did not announce himself and did not need to. Through the same quiet faculty that registered the entrance of the most powerful thing in any space Clark occupied, the sense of a gravity shift, the pressure that certainty of a very high magnitude exerted on the air around it when it moved. He was there, at the far edge of the Wakandan plain, stepping out of a space stone portal, with the measured tread of a man who had been walking toward a specific moment for 30 years, and saw no reason to accelerate at its arrival. The gauntlet was on his left hand, 5 stones in their settings, 5 lights, blue, orange, purple, green, red, 5 aspects of existence gathered into one fist. He was missing one, he knew exactly where it was. The Reality Stone had been scanning the battlefield since the Black Order's deployment, running its ambient assessment of what was real and what could be reshaped. What had returned to Thanos' awareness now was the same uncategorizable absence it had reported before. 5 of the 7 newcomers existed outside this universe's causal record. They were not products of this cosmos. The stone's map of what was real, which was the most comprehensive map of reality, that had ever existed did not contain them. Thanos did not react to this, visibly. He studied Green Lantern's hard light constructs, the containment cage, the barrier running along the main defensive line, the force field apertures, the ring produced reflexively, as Stewart tracked Thanos' position. The Reality Stone could dissolve those. It knew constructs of focused will channeled through a power ring as a known category of this universe's physics, and it knew what to do with known categories. He noted this and said nothing, and continued assessing. He moved his gaze to the woman with the golden rope still wound loosely around her arm, standing over Ebony Maw. The Reality Stone extended toward the lasso, not actively, a reading rather than a reshaping, and found that the artifact was real, present, and outside the stone's knowledge of what should be real and present. The rope did not have an origin point in this universe's physics. The stone could identify it as existing. It could not identify what it was. Thanos' expression shifted by approximately 3 degrees. On a face that had been disciplined by 30 years of absolute certainty, not to register uncertainty. 3 degrees was not a small movement. It was a complete internal reorientation announced through the minimum available external signal. He filed what the stone had returned. Then he moved toward the field. The Reality Stone's first engagement with the League's attacks established the hierarchy efficiently. Green Lantern committed a barrage of hard-light projectiles shaped with the geometric precision of a trained architect, each one a calculated strike at Thanos' approach vector. The stone turned them into flower petals before they covered half the distance, harmless and vivid and settling into the red earth in a scatter of color. The ring produced light made solid by an act of will. The stone produced reality according to its preferences. In this universe, the stone's preferences were absolute. Tony's repulsor fire came next, a spread of full-output blast that would have taken chunks out of a Chitauri warship. The stone turned the energy beams into ribbons that unraveled above Thanos' head and drifted on the Wakandan afternoon wind, catching the light in a way that would have been beautiful if the context had permitted beauty. Then Wonder Woman moved in from his left with the God-Killer sword. The Reality Stone reached for the blade. The sword bent, its geometry distorting under the full pressure of the stone's reshaping power applied directly. Thanos pressing the stone's authority against the weapon's physical existence with the certainty of something that had dissolved planets. The sword did not dissolve. The bend extended for nearly half a second and then reversed, the blade reasserting its original shape as though the stone's pressure had been a language it did not speak and could therefore set aside. The God-Killer sword was a divine artifact from a metaphysical system that predated the Infinity Stone's universe. The stone knew what was real in this cosmos. The sword was not from this cosmos. He looked at the woman holding it. He looked at the space between them with the expression of someone calculating a variable they did not have a prior category for. This was in 30 years of running the most meticulous plan in the universe's history. The second time this had happened, he did not have time to complete the calculation. Something arrived from above at a speed that compressed the air ahead of it into a visible cone of pressure, and that something struck him in the center of his chest with enough kinetic force to shift his footing by 4 inches. Thanos, who had driven the Hulk through the floor of a ship with his bare hands, shifted his footing. Clark had pulled the strike back. He had not arrived at his maximum output, because maximum output without information was waste. He had arrived at the speed and force of an observation, enough to know what the contact told him, not enough to commit to an outcome he had not yet verified. What the contact told him was this: Thanos registered the impact, processed it in approximately 2.2 seconds, and reoriented his full physical attention upward with the expression of a being that had just encountered something. They traded blows. Neither of them was wasting time. Thanos fought with 30 years of combat in every physical environment this universe offered, a body built to function at the intersection of extraordinary physical capability and centuries of refined tactical thinking. Clark fought with the discipline of a man who had learned over 37 years that his power was not the most important thing he brought to a fight. He held back the strike that would have ended the exchange in his favor in the first second because Batman had said 30 seconds and Clark was counting, and because ending the exchange was not the plan. For 8 seconds they were physically matched in a way that moved through several iterations of almost and not quite, each exchange registered. The ground accepted the force of impacts that would have leveled buildings and transmitted it outward through the Wakandan earth in concentric waves. Thor watched from the perimeter and did not move, because reading a fight was also intelligence gathering, and Thor had been doing it long enough to know when to hold. Then Thanos let the Power Stone run directly into his physical output, not as a targeted blast, not as an environmental weapon. He used the Power Stone the way an engine uses fuel, amplifying what his body was already doing, by a factor Clark had not encountered from any physical contact in this universe. The strike connected across Clark's left side, and the force was sufficient to compress the air between impact and ground into something almost solid before Clark covered the 50 meters and the earth accepted what remained. He was not hurt. Nothing in this universe had managed to hurt him in any way that persisted longer than the moment of impact. He lay for exactly 1 second in the crater and looked at the sky above Wakanda and understood what the exchange had told him. His own body was not the problem. The gauntlet was the problem. Thanos plus 4 stones against Clark Kent was a genuine conversation. Thanos plus all 6 was something else entirely. The weapon was not the man. The weapon was what the man was wearing. From the field's edge, Batman had been watching the exchange with the attention of someone who was not assessing who was winning. He was mapping geometry. "The gauntlet is the threat," he said through the comm to Tony, "not the man." "Established," Tony said. "I mean, the target is his hand, specifically his hand, not his body, not his reach, not his tactical positioning. The gap between when the last stone seats and when he closes his fist is the window. Your suit performs the physical removal. Something large enough to occupy his full cognitive and physical attention provides the distraction. The arm gets isolated. A pause. We tried that configuration on Titan. What went wrong? Another pause, shorter and harder. Someone lost their temper, broke the hold. That will not happen this time." Batman's eyes moved to Martian Manhunter at the perimeter. John, who had just linked 7 minds across a battlefield without any of them noticing the connection, was there. "Give me 30 seconds to position." Thanos crossed the battlefield in a step, which was not a figure of speech. The space stone opened a portal at the field's outer edge and delivered him to the field's center, covering 70 meters of burning Wakandan earth in the time it took the portal to open and close. He arrived where Vision lay in the red grass, and Wanda Maximoff stood between him and the dying man she had loved. She held Thanos at the edge of her chaos magic field. She should not have been able to hold him. The gauntlet held 5 stones, 5 kinds of absolute authority over existence, and Wanda Maximoff was one woman with power she had never fully mapped and a grief she had been carrying since Edinburgh. She held him anyway, her magic a roaring red field that pressed against 5 infinity stones and did not quite yield. And what her face showed was not desperation, but the absolute clarity of someone who has decided what they are willing to spend. She destroyed the Mind Stone. A detonation of pure chaos energy that unmade the stone from inside the structure of the gem that housed it. Vision's request fulfilled, the last dignity she could offer him. Thanos, without expression, raised his hand. The time stone pulsed. The air around Vision ran backward for a specific number of seconds, exactly as far as the damage required, undoing and no further. The chaos energy undetonated itself. The Mind Stone reconstituted in Vision's forehead, whole and glowing, and exactly where it had been before Wanda destroyed it. Then Thanos took it. Vision fell. The 6th stone moved into the gauntlet's final setting with a resonance that passed through the field as a pressure change rather than a sound, a shift in the atmospheric weight that every living thing in the Wakandan plain registered in the space between one heartbeat. The gauntlet was complete. All 6, the entire remaining arc of this universe's history, compressed into the mechanics of one hand. Thanos looked at his hand. Not with triumph, not with the relief of completion or the satisfaction of a plan executed well. He looked at the gauntlet with the expression of a man who has been certain of something for 30 years and is now looking at the physical confirmation of his certainty and finding that the confirmation weighs exactly as much as the certainty always did. He had known this moment was coming. He had spent 30 years building toward it. The knowing did not make it light. He raised his eyes to the battlefield, to the Avengers who had been fighting this alone, and had come as close as any version of this had ever been allowed to come. To the 7 newcomers who had arrived from somewhere outside his universe's record and had still not been enough to prevent this, to the man in blue rising from a crater 50 meters away with his eyes fixed on the gauntlet. Thanos looked at all of it. At everyone who had not been able to stop him, he felt something that was not pride and was not regret, something that lived between them in the specific weight of doing the thing you have decided must be done. He closed his hand. Batman had used 30 seconds well. He had used them to think through the failure mode of Titan, not the tactical failure, which was easily identified, but the structural failure underneath the tactical one. On Titan, they had relied on individual participants to hold their positions through direct personal exposure to Thanos' certainty and physical presence. One participant had heard something they could not process without responding to it, and the response had been physical, and physical responses in that situation meant everything broke. The structural failure was this: individual participants in direct contact with extreme provocation could not be trusted not to respond individually. What was needed was a system that replaced individual judgment with a relay. The relay was Martian Manhunter, the psychic link that Jaeon had run through 7 minds in the first minutes of their arrival was still open. All that was required was to route everyone's movement timing through him, instead of their own processing. Superman hit from the front at 3/4 output, enough force to demand Thanos' full physical attention. Wonder Woman drove in from his left with the God-Killer sword, which the Reality Stone could not dissolve, and which therefore had to be physically engaged with, rather than delegated to the Gauntlet's power. Thor brought Stormbreaker down from above with enough lightning that absorbing it required active attention. 3 simultaneous vectors, all of them real, none of them alone sufficient. The combined load pressed against even Thanos' extraordinary processing capacity and found it occupied. Tony's suit closed on the gauntlet hand from below. Jean held them all in the link, the connection running through his own mind at the speed of thought, smoothing every participant's timing into a single coordinated wave. No one acted on grief. No one broke the pattern to respond to what Thanos was communicating with his body or his expression or the absolute weight of his certainty. They moved when the relay said move and held when the relay said hold, and for the first time in any encounter with Thanos in any timeline, the gauntlet attempt had the structural integrity it needed. 2 seconds. Tony's faceplate locked on the approach vector, and the gap was closing, and at 2.4 seconds the gap was close enough that his sensor array registered the heat signature of the Power Stone warming the air between his palm and the gauntlet's surface. Then the Space Stone opened, not a portal, a spatial compression, a localized alteration of the geometry between Tony's closing hand and the gauntlet's surface. The Space Stone did not push Tony sideways. It made the distance between his palm and the gauntlet no longer be the distance it had been. The gap that had been closing became instantaneously a different gap. Tony's arm extended along a vector that now led somewhere that was not the gauntlet. The window closed. Batman, from his concealed position, filed the result with the quality of attention that did not include shock, because he did not permit himself shock when the scenario had been anticipated. 2.4 seconds. The approach had registered the gauntlet's energy signature from within touching distance. The approach had not completed the removal. What this told him, the window was real, and it was too short. He began thinking, immediately, about what produced a longer window than Batman's 30 seconds had been able to engineer. John did not wait. He redirected the link inward at the Mind Stone, specifically the stone whose function was the mind, whose power was the organizing principle of all consciousness, and which therefore had a surface that a sufficiently powerful telepath had broken minds stronger than most planets had produced. He extended toward the Mind Stone with everything he had. What the Mind Stone felt like from inside a direct telepathic push was this: a wall built from every sentient mind in the universe, compressed and galvanized into a single point of absolute psychic density. Not stone, not force, not energy. A wall made of what consciousness weighed when all of it was in one place at once. Trillions of minds, each contributing its weight to the barrier. The Mind Stone did not attack Jayon. It did not push back. It simply was. And what it was everything that had ever thought, compiled into a singular, immovable fact. John staggered. He stayed on his feet because he had the physical constitution of a being in Superman's tier and the psychic discipline of 50,000 years of Martian civilization. But the connection broke, and he was on one knee with one hand, pressed to the Wakandan earth, and his eyes closed against something that was not pain. Be in a lesser mind. Barry Allen was beside him in 0.003 seconds. On. John's hand pressed harder. Against the earth, he breathed. He processed what the contact with the stone had shown him in the fraction of a second before it broke. Not data, not information, but weight. The weight of existing minds everywhere in every galaxy, and the specific, unbearable weight that would be missing when half of them were taken. He stood, his eyes opened. He looked at Barry Allen. The last Green Martian, the man who had survived the death of his entire world and had chosen to keep living through it, was afraid not for himself. For what was about to happen to the universe he was standing in. Barry, he said. He is going to snap. Right now, in the half-second before the snap, Bruce Wayne made a calculation. He could not stop it. This was not a failure of intelligence or planning. It was a fact about the current state of the gap between him and Thanos, and the time the countdown allowed for closing that gap. There was no physical intervention that reached across the distance in the time available. None. He knew this with absolute certainty because Bruce Wayne did not lie to himself about what was impossible. He had learned that lesson at 8 years old in the most specific and permanent way available, and he had spent the subsequent decades building in the space that impossibility left open. Whoever survived needed a plan. He would make sure there was one. Thanos raised his hand. He did not announce it. He did not look around the battlefield or speak about what this meant. The speech had been 30 years long, and it was finished, and what remained was the single mechanical action at the end of it. He closed his fingers. The sound was nothing. Less than nothing. A breath of one knuckle against one palm, barely audible at point-blank range, and then the Wakandan plain was absolutely still, for a duration that the ear could not quite register as a gap, because the gap was too small and the silence was too complete. The battle noise that had been continuous for 40 minutes was simply absent for one moment. That was not quite a moment. Then half of everything began to go. John Stewart felt it reach him. His ring flared to maximum output as his body registered the dissolution in a way that bypassed conscious processing. The ring was still on his finger. The hard light constructs went with him. The containment cage fell. The barrier along the main defensive line collapsed. The architectural precision he had laid across the field vanished with the will that had produced it. The Black Order's cage opened. Arthur Curry became dust between one step and the next. He had been moving toward the field's center with the forward motion of a man who does not know how to move in any direction except toward the problem. He was taking that step. Then the step was not completed. The trident of Neptune struck the Wakandan earth with a sound that carried through the ground and through the air and through every person in earshot. A sound like something being set down for the last time. Barry Allen reached for the Speed Force. At the same moment, the snap reached him. He felt it coming. Not because he was faster than the snap, but because the Speed Force itself registered the event, and Barry was connected to the Speed Force the way a person is connected to breathing, continuously, involuntarily, and in a way that he would notice first when it stopped. His aura flared. The Speed Force energy running through him like current in a wire suddenly ran faster, as if the Force were attempting to pull him past the threshold of what the snap could reach. For a fraction of a second that was very long in Speed Force time, he was both things at once, dissolving and accelerating, caught at the intersection of two forces that each had absolute confidence in their own authority, meeting at the same point. His body went to ash. What it looked like from outside was Barry Allen dissolving the same way everyone else dissolved, a gentle coming apart, the specific particles of a person on the Wakandan wind. What it was inside the physics the Speed Force operated on was something else entirely, something no instrument present could detect, something that would matter later in ways no one standing in the ash field could yet calculate. Clark Kent watched him go. He watched Barry Allen, who had walked into a universe he had never seen before, with the specific optimism of someone who had never seriously considered that the speed of light was a limit rather than a suggestion, dissolve in the red earth of Wakanda, the man who had outrun light, the forensic scientist who had spent 10 years cataloging the details of the world because the details were worth caring about, the one who had come back to his starting position after clearing 300 outriders and said there are still about 47 on the left edge, slightly apologetic, genuinely meaning it. Clark had stood in front of Darkseid. He had held the line at the source wall. He had faced things that called themselves gods and proved themselves wrong against him. He had failed before, in every way the universe provided for failure, and he had gotten back up every time. He had never had the math of the universe reach into the people beside him and take the best of them. He did not rage. Rage at this scale was not a response, it was a postponement of the response, and he needed the response, not the postponement. He stopped. He looked at his hands. Both of them, still whole, still capable of moving what needed moving. Still exactly as useful as they had been 5 seconds ago, which had not been enough to stop this, and which still had to be enough for what came next. He thought about what the symbol on his chest meant. The one that was not a letter. The one that carried a word from a dead language, from dead parents who had sent their only child into the universe with that word instead of their names, because names could be taken and the word could not. The one that did not mean what anyone in this universe would assume it meant: hope. Right now, standing over Barry Allen's ash, hope was the hardest thing Clark Kent had ever been asked to hold. He held it. The field settled into its new shape. The Avengers who remained stood in the gaps left by the ones who had not. Half the Wakandan soldiers, half the Outrider horde, the ambient noise of the battle reduced and changed. Wonder Woman was standing. Batman was already moving, already counting what the snap had left, working with the efficient focus of someone who had accepted the event and moved directly to the next problem. Martian Manhunter was on his feet again with one hand still touching the ground, bearing a weight that had settled on him through the telepathic field when a trillion minds stopped mid-thought. Thanos was already leaving. His crippled arm, the gauntlet hand scorched by what 6-stone power costs even his physiology, hung at his side. He moved with the heavy, unhurried tread of a man who has done the thing he came to do and will not perform relief or satisfaction for an audience that would not understand either. Tony Stark was looking at the place where Peter Parker had been standing. Steve Rogers' shield arm was at his side. He was looking at the field with an expression Clark recognized, because Clark had seen it before in mirrors in the hardest moments of his own history. The expression of someone deciding quietly and privately whether to get up. Clark rose above the Wakandan plain. He rose until the field was spread below him, all of its terrible new geometry visible at once. He looked at what was there and at what was no longer there. He did not look away. The battlefield was not silent. That was the wrong word for what it had become. Wind in the red grass, the creak of Wakanda's energy grid losing power in sections, the low collective sound of people trying not to make noise. What had changed was the quality underneath the specific silence of a space where something recently present is no longer present. A silence that had a shape because the absence had one. Thor drove Stormbreaker into the Wakandan earth and leaned his forehead against the haft. He had buried an axe in Thanos' chest and still managed to fail at the only part that mattered. 10,000 years had given him the self-awareness to know the difference between failure and catastrophe, and the honesty to know he had achieved both simultaneously. "I should have gone for the head," he said. Steve Rogers was standing 20 meters from him, looking at a particular patch of the field. His shield was on his arm, and he was not going to raise it, because there was nothing left to raise it against. And for the first time in his adult life, the calculation of what the shield was for had become briefly insoluble. He did not say anything. Bruce Wayne was already working, moving through the remaining survivors with the quality of attention that made him appear unhurried while covering ground efficiently. He found Tony Stark, faceplate half open, eyes running on a frequency that had nothing to do with the field in front of him. "Thanos has all 6 stones," Batman said. "The snap is complete. he has achieved his objective. The question is what a careful tactician does with the instrument after the objective is achieved. Tony looked at him. Something settled in Tony's expression that had the quality of a man saying something he had been sitting with for too long to hold lightly. He destroys them, so no one can undo what he did. You know this already. I've been thinking about it for 2 years. Once the deed is done, you destroy the instrument. That's what any careful tactician does. A pause. It's what I would do. Then we have hours before the stones are gone and reversal becomes impossible. Batman moved and Tony followed. Gather whoever is left. There is a way through this. It starts with a hypothesis. He found Clark and Wonder Woman and Martian Manhunter at the field's edge, gathered them with a look, and said, "The Flash is not dead." Superman's expression shifted. Something in his eyes that had gone very still since Barry Allen dissolved in the Wakandan earth moved, the way a weight moves when given the possibility of a different position. Batman did not wait for anyone to ask for the rationale. The snap dissolves physical matter belonging to this universe's causal structure. Barry Allen's body belongs to this universe, but Barry Allen is not only his body, he is a conduit of the Speed Force. The Speed Force is a trans-temporal energy dimension. It is not native to this universe's causal record. The snap eliminates what it can quantify. The Speed Force is not quantifiable by this universe's terms. Steve Rogers had moved into earshot without anyone deciding he should be there. You're saying part of him survived. His Speed Force connection persisted. The Force was holding its claim on him at the moment the snap reached his body. That claim did not dissolve with the body because the claim is not made of matter from this universe. Batman looked at Clark. Barry Allen is currently located in the Speed Force. Between moments, he is retrievable, but only by someone fast enough to push through the Speed Force boundary from outside, someone physically capable of surviving that transition. Someone from outside this universe's causal structure, which means the boundary does not read them as an intrusion. Clark absorbed this. "You mean me?" "Yes," a beat. Then, quietly. 60 meters from that exchange, on the ground of the Wakandan plain, Martian Manhunter was sitting with his hands flat against the earth and his eyes closed. Not the posture of a man who had been knocked down. The posture of a man bearing something too large to hold in a standing position, and who had chosen the ground as the most honest place to put it. The snap had passed through the telepathic field he had been maintaining. It moved through at the speed of everything that had ever thought, and took half of it with it. He had felt all of them, not as individuals. Trillions of minds, mid-thought, cut before completion, each one carrying the unfinished quality of a sentence ending without its period. He was sitting now in the silence of a universe. Wonder Woman came and sat beside him. She did not speak. 3,000 years had given her a precise understanding of when speaking was not the right instrument. Sean kept his eyes closed for a long time. He was doing the thing the last Green Martian had learned to do after Ma'aleka Andra died. Holding a loss without making it smaller than it was, because making it smaller was the only thing that would make it unbearable. "I have felt my own world die," he said. His voice was level in the way that level is chosen rather than arrived at. I believed I understood that weight. His eyes opened. They were wet, which was not a thing anyone present had seen before, and not a thing he was performing. "This is larger." Diana held his gaze. No true thing available to her was also comforting, and John Johns did not need comfort that cost the truth. She offered what she had. The presence of someone who had carried impossible weight and chosen, each time not to put it down. Then we carry it together, she said, and we do not stop. Tony Stark found the man with the glyph on the ridge above the field, the same ridge where Thor had briefed him on the stones in the first hour. Clark was sitting with his back straight and his hands on his knees, present to a difficult thing rather than moving around it. Tony sat next to him. You failed. Clark looked at him. Not as a judgment. Tony looked at the field below, where the armor's sensor array was still flagging positions that corresponded to nothing present. You are the most powerful being I've ever scanned, and you still failed. How do you keep getting up when it doesn't matter how strong you are? Clark was quiet. Below them, the survivors were gathering toward the facility, Batman already inside, already building something. Because it's not about strength, he said. That is a very easy thing to say when you can lift a planet. I know. He said it without argument, the way someone says a thing they've heard before and learned to receive as true. The symbol on my chest, it's not a letter. In Kryptonian, it's the glyph for hope. Tony was quiet for 2 seconds. That is either the most functionally useful thing I've heard today or the most naively catastrophic. Both sometimes. Clark looked at his hands. Still whole. Still capable of the same things they had been capable of before the snap, which had not been enough, and had to be enough for what came next. Right now it's the only tool we have. So we're going to find out which one it is. Tony closed the faceplate. Good. I've been running on stupid responses to losing positions since 2008. Let's go get your friend. Diana of Themyscira stood alone at the far edge of the field where the breach had been. The sky above it was ordinary now. No light that didn't belong to this universe. No wound in the fabric between realities. They had come through it, and it had closed behind them, and whatever was on the other side, home, the world they were responsible for, was inaccessible until the work here was done. She was thinking about a rule. She had heard the Avengers reference. The soul stone on Vormir, you cannot take it without sacrificing someone you love. A rule this universe ran on, absolute, no exceptions. She had filed it when she first heard it, and it had been running ever since the way a calculation runs that you did not ask for. She was thinking about Barry Allen. About the specific quality of Barry at his best, which was the quality of someone who was afraid of most things and went toward all of them anyway. Steve Rogers had said, "We don't trade lives." This universe, she was beginning to understand, had its own answer to that. Its own math about what it cost to undo the largest act of murder in its history. She had stood in front of absolute rules before. She knew the difference between a rule that could be argued with and a rule that was simply true. She closed her hand around the God-Killer sword's hilt and made herself release it without drawing. There was still work to do before the cost arrived. What she could control was making sure that when it arrived, it was paid by someone who had chosen it. She turned back toward the light of the facility and walked toward the others. They worked below Wakanda's shielded facility in a room Tony Stark had commandeered with the quiet efficiency of a man who had developed a method for this over 20 years. Holographic displays at every usable surface. A secondary array running the calculation Tony had been sitting on for 3 years, the one built in the quiet hours after Morgan was born and locked away because the cost of being wrong about it was not payable. He was paying it now, regardless. Bruce Wayne sat across the display and looked at the quantum realm data with the expression of someone absorbing information and immediately reclassifying it against an existing framework, not reading. Translating. Tony recognized the difference after 30 seconds because he had spent his adult life in rooms with technically capable people, and knew whether the person opposite him was following or building. The man in the cowl was building. The quantum realm gives you access to displaced time, Batman said. Points in the past where the stones existed in their ungathered forms. You send someone in, retrieve the stone from that past moment, and return before a branching timeline is created. That's the theory. We almost proved it under slightly different circumstances. The problem with the quantum realm as a time-travel mechanism is that it uses this universe's causal structure as its navigation system. Any stone retrieved through it arrives in a branching timeline rather than the main one, which means the snap's victims are restored in a branch, not here. Batman looked at the display and then at Tony. But the Speed Force is not this universe's causal structure. It is a trans-temporal energy dimension that exists between moments as a physical location, not as a theoretical construct. Someone navigating through the Speed Force is not traveling through this universe's timeline. They are traveling through a dimension that runs alongside it. Tony was quiet for the 4 seconds it took to complete the implication, which means a Speed Force retrieval doesn't create a branch. You pull the stone from the past point without forking the timeline because you never entered the timeline to get it. Correct. Tony stared at the display. He thought about how long it had taken him to build the quantum tunnel theory, and how long it had taken the man opposite him to identify its fundamental limitation and route around it. He had built the door. This man had found the window. Ah, that is the most elegant solution I have ever heard from someone wearing a cape, Tony said. I'm wearing a cowl. Same energy. He expanded the display and opened a new file. The reverse snap toll. Doubling all 6 stones simultaneously generates a gamma energy discharge that is lethal to any standard biological system. Hulk survived it because his physiology is specifically adapted to absorb gamma radiation. Anyone else who tries it dies. Barry Allen is not anyone else, Batman said. After existing in the Speed Force in a bodiless state, his connection to it will have deepened. The Speed Force already distributes temporal stress across his connection rather than absorbing it at a single point. The gamma toll from the stones passes through his Speed Force conduit and spreads across time, attenuated rather than concentrated. The damage is survivable. Probably they worked. 6 hours the display accumulating layers until it resembled the inside of a mind that thought in equations. When they were done, Tony closed the display and sat back in the specific quiet that follows the completion of the largest thing you have ever built. Thor found Clark on the ridge when the planning session was still running below. He did not ask permission to sit, because God's extended presence and let the other being choose. Clark let him stay. You hit Thanos harder than the Hulk, Thor said. I have a baseline for comparison. The gauntlet makes it not enough. There is nothing in the physical world that is enough against the gauntlet. He looked at the field below. This is not a failure of strength. It is a failure of category. You cannot solve a problem by being more of what it was designed to defeat. So the solution to the gauntlet is the removal of the gauntlet. Yes. Thor glanced toward the facility. I have been listening from approximately 40 meters. The plan is both reassuring and deeply unsettling, which in my experience means it has a reasonable chance of working. Clark looked at him. Why unsettling? Because it depends on a man I have known for 6 hours and a variable I cannot verify. Those plans either work perfectly or fail in the most spectacular manner available. A pause. I intend to be standing next to them either way. Dr. Strange found Clark at the facility's edge as the sun over Wakanda moved toward late afternoon. The Sorcerer Supreme had been watching the planning from a position outside it because the Time Stone was still in his possession and the Time Stone was still running. What it was showing him required a quiet place to read accurately. "The plan your friend in the armor is building," he said. "It works. Under what conditions? The one you're going to retrieve has to be willing to pay the toll. The Speed Force distributes the stone energy, but distribute does not mean eliminate. There is still a cost. He has to choose it, knowing what it is. He will be—" Strange held his gaze for a moment. "I know. That's the condition that makes the line viable. Not someone capable, someone willing." He started to turn. "Go and get him. The stone destruction window is narrowing. Clark, how many futures have this ending?" Strange did not slow enough. Wanda Maximoff was sitting in the lower level with Vision's vibranium body beside her. The Mind Stone was gone from his forehead, the absence visible as a wound cleaned but not healed. He could not be restored by the reverse. Snap, his death came from stone removal, not the snap itself, and the reversal undid only what the snap had done. Batman had told her this because Batman told hard truths cleanly, and she had needed the truth more than she had needed it to be soft. Wonder Woman came and sat beside her, not across from her, beside. Diana sat the way a soldier sits when composure is not performed, but found through a different route, the route of someone who has been doing difficult things long enough to know that how you sit matters to the person next to you. Wanda's chaos magic was a low red shimmer at the edges of her hands, running the way a person breathes when not thinking about breathing. "When the time comes," Diana said, "will you fight?" A long silence. "Yes." "Then rest now, save it." Diana did not look at Vision. "What you carry is real. You do not have to put it down to keep going." Wanda closed her hands, the red shimmer settling inward. She was not all right. She was going to keep going. Those were not the same thing, and Diana had not pretended they were. Batman stood at the center of the assembled survivors and presented the plan in the way he presented everything, without preamble, without motivational architecture, with the efficient assumption that the people in the room were capable of receiving information without being told how to feel about it. Superman retrieves Barry Allen from the Speed Force. The retrieval deepens his Speed Force connection beyond its original state, which matters for the next step. Tony Stark has developed the Time Heist Protocol, which identifies the past moments where each stone existed in ungathered form. Barry Allen uses the Speed Force, rather than the quantum realm, as his time travel mechanism, which means the retrieved stones arrive in this timeline rather than a branch. The assembled stones are wielded by Barry Allen to reverse the snap. His deepened Speed Force connection distributes the energy toll across his connection to the Force, rather than absorbing it as a single moment he survives. Probably, Batman added, because precision required it. The room was quiet, with the weight of that word. Steve Rogers spoke first. "And what does this cost?" "Barry's willingness and the risk to him, that is the price this plan asks." Batman looked around the room. "He gets to choose. We go and retrieve him first. Then he chooses." Superman stood. "Then let's go get him." Thor raised Stormbreaker. Tony closed the faceplate. Steve picked up his shield from where it had been resting against the wall since the snap and settled it on his arm. Wonder Woman rose from beside Wanda Maximoff, and Wanda rose with her. Not enough? 6 hours ago? 2 universes aimed at the same impossible problem with the same tools, and the same stubborn refusal to accept the math as the final word. Possibly enough, right now. The garden world had no name in the Avengers records. Not Titan, not any coordinate Tony's armor could cross-reference. A quiet place, fertile, things growing in it. Things had been growing there before the group arrived and would continue to grow after they left. Not resting, seated in the way of someone who has completed the largest action of their life and is now inside the silence that follows completion, a silence that is not peace, but simply the absence of all the motion that preceded it. His crippled arm lay across his knee, the gauntlet hand scorched past function. The stones gone from their settings because he had used the completed gauntlet one final time to destroy them. He did not look up when they arrived. He had known they were coming. "I wondered if you would come," he said. Superman stepped forward not threateningly. The way you step forward when you have something to say. "We have questions." "I have already answered them," the Mad Titan said. "The universe has answered them." The argument began because the argument was not optional. It was not a misunderstanding, and it was not a conflict that could be resolved by one side being wrong about the facts. Both positions were internally consistent. Both had been arrived at by beings who had thought carefully. The disagreement was not about the facts, it was about what the facts meant. Thanos' Titan was like most planets. Finite resources, exponential population. I proposed a solution. Painless, random fare. They refused me. I watched my world collapse under the weight of its refusal to accept a mathematical certainty. I decided the universe would not do the same. Clark, you decided that half of everything had to die because you couldn't persuade your own people. You took one world's political failure and turned it into a cosmic mandate. I took one world's proof and applied it universally. The math does not change because the scale changes. The math assumes the only variable is population. It doesn't account for ingenuity, discovery, cooperation. My universe has faced resource collapse before. Thanos looked at him for the first time, not contemptuous. The expression of a being who has heard a counter-argument before and already has an answer. Every solution your universe found required sacrifice. You know this. You wear hope on your chest, but hope always has a cost. You are choosing not to look at directly. Clark went quiet, because Thanos was not entirely wrong. Hope was not free. Every time Clark had saved something, it had cost something else, and the calculus of what he had spent versus what he had preserved was not as clean as the symbol on his chest made it appear. The difference between his position and Thanos's position was not that one acknowledged cost and the other did not. The cost of hope, he said, is effort. The cost of what you did is people. Thanos. The argument stopped, not because either position had yielded, but because it had reached the place where words were no longer the right instrument for the job. Wonder Woman had been waiting for exactly this moment. She had the lasso loose in her hand. She crossed the space and stood over the Titan, seated in his garden, and said, "You will allow me to put this around you." Thanos looked at the golden rope. He was still seated. He was not afraid of it. A being that is not lying has nothing to fear from a truth compulsion. In 30 years of executing the most ambitious plan in the universe's history, he had never had his certainty tested by an instrument that operated on truth rather than force. He was curious. "Do it," he said. The lasso settled around him. What it found was not deception. What the lasso found in Thanos was something far more frightening than a lie. A man who believed every word he had ever said about mercy and necessity and the correct mathematics of existence completely and without qualification. "Wonder Woman, why did you do it?" "Because it was necessary," Why was it necessary? Because without it, life consumes itself. I watched my own world prove the theorem. Do you believe you were merciful? A pause. Not evasion. Yes. Would you do it again? Yes. Without hesitation, if the stones were gatherable. The assembled group was silent. Thor, Steve Rogers, Tony Stark. All of them, because the lasso was still around Thanos, and the lasso did not allow performance, and what was sitting in front of them was the most frightening thing any of them had witnessed in any battle or briefing room, a being who had committed the largest act of murder in the universe's history and was not lying about a single word of it. Wonder Woman did not release the lasso. She stood over him and said what she had come to say. "You are not lying," she said. "You are wrong. And I know the difference because I have stood in the presence of beings who lied about their mercy and beings who believed their cruelty was necessary. And you are the second kind. The second kind tends to be correct. The second kind tends to have stopped looking. You stopped looking when Titan refused you. You made their failure your mandate. You decided the universe had to conform to what your world had proven, rather than asking whether your world had proven the wrong thing. He did not answer immediately. Not because the lasso was preventing it, because he was, for the first time in a conversation about his certainty, considering the premise rather than the data. "Then show me the alternative," he said. "Show me the world that hope built." Diana turned. Clark was standing behind her. He stepped forward. He looked at Thanos, the crippled arm, the face of a being who had done the worst thing in the universe's history and believed it had been required. Not performing conviction, but living inside it, who had sat in a garden and waited because he was certain enough to let his position be argued. "I come from a world that has faced extinction," Clark said. "Multiple times, we have faced beings who claimed their genocide was mercy. We have faced the literal embodiment of the argument that life is meaningless, and the only honest response is surrender." He thought about Darkseid, about the anti-life equation pressed against every free mind it could reach, the mathematical proof that free will was the delusion and submission was the truth. Every time we found another way, not because we were lucky, because we refused to accept that the math was the final language available. You come from a universe that has not yet faced what Titan faced. Maybe. But we are here now, in your universe. And we are going to bring back every person you took, all of them, without sacrificing half of something else to do it. Thanos was quiet. The lasso was still around him. He was looking at Clark with an expression that was not concession and not agreement, but had in it something that had not been present in his face for 30 years, genuine curiosity. Not about whether Clark was right, about whether Clark would be able to do what he was claiming. "It will cost you something," Thanos said. "Not a threat, a fact," Clark quietly. "Yes, but we will choose the cost. Not you, not the math, us." A long silence. Thanos looked at the ground of his garden, at the things growing there. He was not reconsidering the snap. He was considering the specific claim in front of him, the claim that the equation he had run for 30 years had a solution he had not found. "Then I will watch," he said. "I will watch you build your alternative." Wonder Woman released the lasso. As the group turned to leave, Thanos said one more thing. He said it to the air in front of him, in the voice of a being reporting an observation. The speedster, the one who dissolved. He was looking at the ground. The speed in him resisted. The snap has taken beings built for resistance. Energy absorption, physiology, healing factors, cellular structures, operating outside standard biology. None of them resisted. He did. Batman, Not turning, I know. What does that tell you? That the math has exceptions it hasn't found yet. The silence stretched across the garden. Then from Thanos, something that occupied the space between a word and a breath. Perhaps. The first crack, small enough to miss. Not a recantation, not an apology, not defeat. A single syllable acknowledging that something in the equation had returned a result he had not predicted from a man honest enough, even now, to file the result accurately. The group walked away from the nameless garden into the narrow remaining window before the stones were gone, carrying the only word Thanos had ever spoken that sounded like a door instead of a wall. The calculation was simple to state and almost impossible to execute. Tony had run it 6 times and arrived at the same answer each time, which was the answer you got when you asked what it cost to break through the boundary of a trans-temporal energy dimension from the outside rather than being invited in. The Speed Force did not have a front door. Barry Allen had not entered it the way a person enters a room. He had been born with a connection to it, and across years of use, the connection had deepened until the Speed Force was less a place he traveled to and more a dimension he was continuously embedded in. Superman was not embedded in the Speed Force. He was a Kryptonian under a yellow sun, a solar energy battery with a nervous system and a conscience, neither of which gave him a native relationship to a trans-temporal energy dimension from another universe. What he had instead was near-limitless kinetic output, a body that had survived deep space and the event horizon of physical phenomena that had no name in this universe's taxonomy, and the specific stubbornness of a man who had inherited from 2 sets of parents the same core refusal to accept that the thing in front of him was impossible. The boundary of the Speed Force responds to kinetic input, Batman said. This was a hypothesis because no one in this universe had ever tested it and survived. It was built in its own universe's physics to respond to someone running fast enough to cross it. Running faster than anything native to its home universe could run. You replicate that. Not with legs, with everything you have. Tony, the energy signature you'd need to generate is approximately what you'd produce if you flew directly into a star at terminal velocity. Clark, how close to a star do we need to be? Tony looked at him. I was using it as an analogy for the energy level. You don't need a star. Can I generate that output on my own? Based on what I've measured from you. Tony ran the numbers one more time, because running numbers one more time was what Tony Stark did when the stakes were high enough that he needed to know the answer was still the same answer. Yes, probably. Clark turned and faced open sky. How will I know when I'm through? Batman, you'll know the Speed Force is not a physical location in this universe's spatial geometry. It's a place that exists between moments. When you cross the boundary, the physics will be different, significantly different, and Barry. He will be present as a connection rather than a body. The Speed Force holds whatever the snap left of him, which is his conduit, his relationship to it. The part of him that was not made of this universe's matter. A pause. Find what's left of the connection. Pull it back. The body will follow the conduit. Clark looked at the sky for one moment. He was not calculating his chances. He had long since learned that calculating chances in situations like this one produced a number that was not useful, because the number was not the deciding factor. The deciding factor was whether the thing in front of him was worth attempting regardless of the number he went. The Speed Force boundary was not visible from the outside. It was not a wall. It was not a membrane. It was a transition point between this universe's causal structure and a dimension that ran alongside it the way a river runs alongside a road, parallel, operating on the same ground but by completely different rules. From the outside, it was nothing at all. It was empty sky with a threshold in it that had no physical marker. Clark hit it at a speed that the Wakandan plane registered as a sonic event from 100 kilometers away, a crack in the air that the remaining Avengers and Leaguers heard and felt through the ground. Not an explosion, the sound of kinetic energy being applied to a boundary that had never been tested from this side. The boundary held for 0.6 seconds. Then it didn't. The speed force from the inside was not dark, and it was not bright, and it was not any color that existed in normal visible light. It was the color of motion itself. If motion had a color, the visual equivalent of the feeling you get when you understand something that you could not understand a moment before. Light that moved the way thought moved, rather than the way photons moved, a place where the physics of direction, of before and after, of here and there, operated on completely different assumptions than the universe outside it. Clark had been to the edge of the source wall. He had stood in the gravity well of a dying star. Both of those experiences had registered on his senses as large. The speed force was not large, it was dense. The compression of all movement that had ever occurred into a single space that existed outside of space, and being inside it was like being inside the verb rather than the noun, inside the act of a thing rather than the thing itself. He looked for Barry, not with his eyes, which were functionally useless where light did not behave as light, with the extrasensory awareness built across 37 years of perception that extended past the human band in every direction, the awareness that registered presences as textures, that could distinguish a living mind from a machine by something that was not quite sound and not quite heat, but was most accurately described as the feeling of intention at work in matter. Barry Allen was not a body here. He was a current, a specific pattern of speed-force energy moving through the dimension in the particular rhythm of a person who was not running, but existed as a quality of running itself, a person whose relationship to the force had been so central to what he was that when the snap had taken the body, the force had refused to relinquish the pattern. The current felt like Barry. Clark could not have explained how he knew this, but he knew it with the certainty that people know the voices of those they have stood next to in battle, by a quality of character that persists in the specific way a thing moves, rather than what it looks like. The rhythm was Barry's optimistic, even here, even reduced to pure kinetic potential in a dimension outside time. The pattern of energy that had been Barry Allen still moved with the quality of someone who had never found a compelling reason to stop. Clark reached for it. Physical retrieval was not the right frame for what happened. There was no hand reaching into the speed force and grabbing a current. What Clark did was more like what happens when a strong electrical potential contacts a conducting medium, the force current that was Barry Allen oriented toward him. Because Clark was a massive solar energy battery, and the speed force was a kinetic energy dimension. One type of stored power finding the appropriate receptor. The current moved toward Clark, gathered, concentrated, the threshold crossed. Barry Allen fell out of the speed force and landed on the Wakandan earth with the specific momentum of someone who had been between moments and was now decisively back inside them, both feet finding the ground with a solidity that suggested the ground had been worried about him and was relieved to have him back. He was breathing. He stood up. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at Clark, who had landed beside him with rather more control and rather less surprise. "How long was I gone?" Barry said. "Several hours." Barry looked at the sky. He looked at the field around them, at the Avengers and Leaguers who had gathered at a distance that was respectful of the fact that two people had just come back from outside the normal physics of the universe and might need a moment. He looked at the ash still present in the Wakandan earth, the the specific presence of the people who had not come back yet. "I felt all of it," he said. "In there, every moment happening everywhere simultaneously. The Speed Force shows you time the way a map shows you a country, all at once, no before or after." He was quiet for a moment. "I know where the stones were. I can feel the moments they were ungathered. All 5 of them." Clark looked at him. The specific quality of Barry Allen's eyes had changed. Not visibly. The change was in the register, a depth that had not been there before. The particular depth that comes from spending time in a place where time means something different and returning with that knowledge still active in your nervous system. "Are you all right?" Clark said. Barry considered this with a seriousness that was new and that sat alongside a familiar quality of him, the optimism that had survived even the Speed Force's compression. "I think I'm more than I was," he said. "That's different from all right. But it's not worse." He looked at the group waiting for them. "Tell me the plan," he said. Barry Allen stood at the edge of the Speed Force boundary and felt the 5 moments the way a musician feels a chord before playing it. All at once, each one distinct, the shape of the whole, present before any individual note. The ungathered stones existed in specific past moments across this universe's timeline. The Space Stone, in a vault in Norway, in 2012, the same vault it had occupied before Loki took it, and a chain of catastrophes had begun. The Reality Stone, in a research facility on Asgard, liquid and strange, before the Convergence had drawn it out. The Power Stone, in a temple on a dead planet, whose name no living species remembered. The Time Stone in the Sanctum Sanctorum in New York, months before Ebony Moore had come to take it. The Mind Stone presented a different problem from the others, one that Batman had flagged when they were planning. It could not be retrieved from a past moment without removing it from Vision's forehead in that moment, which would kill Vision in that timeline. What it could be retrieved from was the last moment before Thanos ripped it out. The gap between Wanda's destruction of the stone and its reconstitution by the Time Stone was, in Speed Force time, a very long gap indeed. The man in red closed his eyes and stepped through the boundary and was gone. He was back in 4.7 seconds. He was holding 5 Infinity Stones. He set them down on the facility table with the careful precision of someone who understood that each item in his hands was a singularity predating the universe and had decided to treat them accordingly. They did not glow the way they had glowed in the gauntlet. Without their housing, they were quieter, but the air around them still had the quality of air around something that is fundamentally rewriting the physics of the space it occupies, just by being present. Tony looked at the 5 stones on the table, then at Barry, then at the table again. 4.7 seconds, he said. "I took my time," Barry said. He meant it sincerely. Tony looked at Batman. He was not looking at the 5 stones. He was looking at the space on the table where the 6th stone was not. "The Soul Stone," Batman said. The room understood this before he said anything else, because the Soul Stone had been the axis around which the worst of the planning had turned since Diana had stood at the edge of the Wakandan field and felt the Vormir rule running in the back of her awareness like a calculation she had not asked for. The Speed Force could navigate the timeline. The Speed Force could pull a stone from any past moment where it had existed in ungathered form. The Soul Stone had never existed in an ungathered moment accessible to Speed Force navigation, because the Soul Stone on Vormir had always had its price, and the price was always paid before the stone was moved, and the Speed Force could not retrieve a stone by erasing the sacrifice that had already been made to claim it without unmaking the claim itself. The Soul Stone required a living sacrifice, a soul given for a soul, not metaphorically, not approximately. The rule of Vormir was absolute, confirmed in the permanent weight that Thanos carried from giving Gamora to it. Confirmed in the way no workaround or substitution the Avengers had attempted in their planning had ever resolved the rule rather than simply discovering it again from a different direction. "There is no other way to get it," Tony said. He had already known this. He had been sitting with it since the planning session. He said it aloud now, because saying it aloud was the honest thing to do, and Tony Stark had learned later in life than he should have that honesty about hard things at the moment they needed to be said was more useful than the alternative. Batman, 2 people go to Vormir. One comes back with the stone. Steve Rogers had been standing at the edge of the planning table with his shield on his arm, and his eyes on the space where the Soul Stone was not. He looked at Natasha Romanoff, who was standing beside him, and who had been standing beside him in difficult rooms for years, and who was looking at the table with the particular expression of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to state it. She caught him looking. "No," Steve said. "Steve, no." The word came out with the full weight of everything he had meant by "we don't trade lives" across the years he had been saying it. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," she said, quietly, with the complete absence of drama that was the thing about Natasha Romanoff that had always been the hardest to argue with. She was not performing courage. She was simply describing the situation accurately, and the situation was, she had already decided, and she had already decided before this conversation started, and she was telling him now rather than letting him come to it on his own, because she knew that if he came to it on his own, the decision would feel less like hers and more like something that had happened to both of them. "Someone has to go, someone who can make the argument for why it should be them." She looked at him steadily. "You have to bring the stone back. I'm the one who goes, Nat." He stopped. There was nothing in the word that was enough. "Steve," she put her hand on his arm, not to stop him, to include him. "Let me choose the cost. You said that someone should choose it." She looked at the others in the room, at Diana and Jayon and Clark, and Barry, at Thor and Tony and Wanda, at all the different weights all of them were carrying. "Let me choose it." He could not stop her. He had understood this before she said it, in the same way that Steve Rogers had always understood the things he did not want to understand, immediately, with his whole chest, and without any useful way to argue himself out of it. They went to Vormir together. The cliff on Vormir had a quality that no location in any universe that either of them had visited possessed. It felt like the end of the argument. Not a place where arguments were resolved, but a place where they simply stopped mattering, where the physics of the universe asserted themselves past any individual position any individual person had held. The red sky above it had the quality of a sky that had been red for longer than most civilizations had existed. Natasha Romanoff went over the edge before Steve Rogers' hands could reach her. She did not fall. There was a difference, and she had made sure the difference was visible. The Soul Stone was in Steve Rogers' hand when he landed at the cliff's base, and its weight was not the weight of a gem. It was the weight of knowing what it had cost, held in the palm of a man who had said, "We don't trade lives," and had then stood on a cliff while a trade was made and had not been able to prevent it. He looked at the stone for a long time. Then he went back. The 6 stones were assembled on Tony Stark's containment array, a reconstruction of the Gauntlet's essential physics built from Wakandan vibranium and the Mark 50's nanomaterial, and 5 days of work that Tony and Bruce Banner had completed in parallel shifts without sleeping. 5 stones from 5 past moments, retrieved by a man who had spent time between moments and come back knowing where everything was. 1 stone from a cliff on a world where the price of everything is finally stated plainly. 6 lights in their settings: blue, red, purple, orange, green, yellow. Barry Allen looked at the assembled gauntlet and was quiet for a moment. He had been told what the toll would be in the meeting after he came back from the Speed Force, told in the specific detail that Batman delivered hard truths, which was the detail of someone who believed you deserved to know exactly what you were agreeing to. The Speed Force would distribute the gamma discharge across his connection to it. The damage would be spread across time rather than absorbed in a single moment. He would probably survive. Probably. I know, he said before anyone could say anything. I've already decided. He looked at Clark. Clark, who had gone into the Speed Force to retrieve him. Clark, who had held hope over Barry Allen's ash in the Wakandan field, with his hands at his sides and his eyes open. "It's what the symbol means, right?" Barry said. Clark looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that's what it means." Barry reached for the gauntlet. Barry Allen put the Stark gauntlet on his hand. He looked at the 6 stones in their settings for the amount of time it took him to think about every person he was doing this for, holding all of them at once, the way only a man who had spent time inside the Speed Force could hold anything. "Okay," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. To the universe," he snapped. The energy of 6 Infinity Stones met the Speed Force conduit, and the Speed Force immediately metabolized it, bleeding the discharge backward and forward through Barry Allen's timeline, rather than letting it collect into a single lethal moment. The gauntlet arm burned from elbow to fingertips, the Speed Force aura running white gold across his body working. He was on his knees before the wave finished. He stayed conscious. The Wakandan field filled. Not all at once, and not with sound. They came back the way the snapped had gone, with the quietness of physics executing a correction, each person returning to the position the snap had taken them from. Soldiers finding the ground under their feet again, Green Lantern materializing with his ring lit, Aquaman reaching for the trident of Neptune where it had fallen. The universe's second half returning to itself. Piece by piece, Martian Manhunter felt it come back. The half-quiet that had pressed against him since the snap filled back in, mind by mind, across the Wakandan plain and outward, across the planet and beyond, until the psychic field was whole again. The weight Jehon had been carrying was replaced by a different weight, everything that should be there, present, again, audible, again. His eyes closed, his hands opened. Wonder Woman was already kneeling beside Barry Allen when he tried to stand. His arm was burned in patterns that looked like lightning pressed into skin. The Speed Force was still moving through him at the cellular level, working the damage the way it worked, everything distributed, persistent, committed. "Did it work?" he said. "Yes." "Take it," she said. Steve Rogers stood apart from the reunion, holding nothing, watching the field fill back up with people and counting, silently. The one face that would not be among them. He had let her. The people she chose to save were coming back to a field she would never walk back into, and Steve Rogers was the kind of man who looked at both of those facts simultaneously and did not look away from either of them. The 2 permanent costs were visible in the world's new shape. Vision's body lay in the facility below, the Mind Stone's absence still present in his forehead. His death had come from stone removal, not the snap, and the reverse snap restored only what the snap had taken. Natasha Romanoff was not among the returning. Her death had come from Vormir, and the Vormir rule was absolute and had been paid exactly as it had always been paid. The world was whole again. Wonder Woman found Thanos where they had left him, sitting in the burned Wakandan field with his crippled arm across his knee and his eyes on the middle distance. She sat across from him without the lasso, without the sword. "You watched it," she said. "Yes, your math was wrong. He was quiet for a long time. The quality of his silence was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a being recalibrating with genuine attention, the way a mathematician sits with an error that has been proven rather than asserted. The math was internally consistent, he said finally. The assumption it rested on was wrong. Which assumption? That no one could pay a smaller price for the same result. He looked at the field where Barry Allen had knelt. I did not include beings from outside this universe's causal structure. They did not appear in the calculation. Because you built the calculation on what this universe contained, and what this universe contained, he almost made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Very small. Not humor. It was not. What will you do? Thanos looked at his crippled arm, at the hand that had worn the gauntlet, at the evidence of what 6-stone power cost even a body like his. What I have always done, recalculate. He looked at her. For now she held his gaze. For now is not an endorsement. I know. She stood. The universe has more variables than your math included. Remember that when you recalculate, she left him sitting with the ruins of a certainty, 30 years in the building. He did not look like a defeated enemy. He looked like a mathematician who had found an error in a proof he was certain was complete. That was, in some ways, more frightening. Bruce Wayne handed Tony Stark a drive that was too low tech for Tony's standards. Tony took it anyway. What is this? Every threat in this universe that exceeds Thanos. Everything I could extrapolate from what Jaeon read from your people's minds, and what Strange said about the futures he walked through. Reigned by probability, and by what you currently have available to counter each one. Tony looked at the drive. You just met us 16 hours ago. I've been working. You're terrifying. I've been told Batman held the drive out. There is no kryptonite in this universe. My contingency plans for Clark are not included. He's not staying. Tony took the drive. Neither of them said anything that functioned as goodbye, because neither of them was the kind of person who found that category of sentence useful. The breach could be reopened. Martian Manhunter had located the dimensional seam, the residue of where the tear had been, and with Clark's solar output and Jaeon's psychic guidance, the seam could be pushed back open. The question was whether the League stayed. Superman looked at Steve Rogers, at Thor, at this world that had survived the worst day in its history and was still standing, at Tony Stark, who had a daughter at home, at Steve Rogers, who had gone to Vormir and come back and was not ready to speak about it yet. This world has its own heroes, Clark said. It doesn't need us to save it. It needed us here. For this, what comes next, is yours. Steve Rogers extended his hand. The man with the glyph on his chest took it. Thor, you are welcome in Asgard, any of you at any time. Barry Allen, arm-wrapped, the Speed Force still sparking in new patterns at his fingertips. Does Asgard have coffee? We have mead. I'll take it. The seam tore open again, not a wound this time. A doorway, deliberate, held open by Clark's solar output while the League stepped through. Wonder Woman first, sheathing the God-Killer sword as she went. Aquaman, Green Lantern, Shazam. Barry Allen, moving with the careful quality of someone whose relationship to velocity has permanently deepened and is still calibrating the new terms of it. He lingered at the threshold and pressed his palm flat against the air of this universe's atmosphere, feeling the weight of the trillion minds he had carried through the darkest part of the night, whole again now, audible again. He held them for one more moment, then through. Clark was last. He hovered at the edge of the breach, half in and half out, and looked back. At the universe where sacrifice was the price of victory, and hope was not a consolation, but a different kind of math. At the Avengers, standing in the Wakandan field in the late afternoon light, at a world that was going to carry its costs and keep going anyway. He turned. The breach closed behind him. The world was quiet. Somewhere in the restored universe, Tony Stark went home. Somewhere in it, Thanos sat in a garden and recalculated. In the space where the breach had been, the dimensional seam was thinner than before. 7 beings had passed through it and left something behind, not physical, not visible, but real, in the way that very large things are real even after they are gone. And in the bleed between realities, in the space that was not quite the absence of light, but the presence of something older, something took note of the breach, of what had passed through it, of the fact that the barrier between one universe's math and another universe's hope had, for one day, come down. The record of that breach did not close with the seam. It remained. A signal pointed outward. All right, now that we've seen what happens when the Justice League walks into the universe's worst day and refuses to accept the math, your turn. Which character deserves to finally cut loose in a world that has no business surviving them? Drop a name in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you want more crossovers like this, drop a like and hit subscribe so you don't